Hello and welcome to the Chorosophy Podcast. My name is Chris Muntz and this is episode 73, Love Supreme, with Professor Teodros Kiros of Berkeley School of Music. Professor Kiros is an executive producer and host of the television program African Ascent. He is also a W.E.B. Du Bois Fellow at Harvard. He is a professor of philosophy at Berklee College of Music. One of the more profound conversations that you will ever hear on the Chorosophy Podcast is coming up soon. But first, a quote from Professor Kiros. I try to argue that they can become better musicians if they become philosophically trained. They will become sensitive to aesthetics in their lives, to the role that art plays in their lives. I feel like I caught lightning in a bottle with this episode. We are all incredibly fortunate to have the chance to absorb wisdom from Professor Kiros. Dr. Kiros and I discussed the many connections between philosophical training and musical training. I was spellbound many times throughout this conversation, hearing about how inseparable music and philosophy should be. We discussed the common humanity that is unearthed through the sharing of musical and philosophical ideas throughout history, the most scholarly unpacking of cultural appropriation that I have come across yet, as well as an in-depth discussion of the metaphors found within Coltrane's Love Supreme, and why, with that one piece of music, we can find a unifying theme for our life and for our music. You do not want to miss this conversation. Stick around all the way to the end. Did you know that the Chorosophy Podcast is entirely listener supported? So the way you support, as a listener, the show is by a win-win scenario, which is just the ideal situation. It's win-win, which means that if you get a discount, I get kickback. That's how it all works. Right. So that's listener supported, meaning you choose to purchase those things like a Sight Reading Factory membership, like some choir folders next year for your choir at mymusicfolders.com. You choose to buy some sheet music at ryanmain.com or graphitepublishing.com. Every time you enter the promo code Chorosophy at checkout at any of those vendors, you get 10% off. There's also Voce Vista Video, which is that overtone analyzing software that I geek out about so much. It is a must. Get it in time for school year next year to start. It is fantastic. You go to vocevistavideo.com/Chorosophy, and there you can download the software for free and play with it for 30 days. Once you decide you want to buy it, then you can enter in that Chorosophy promo code. So that's just a little behind the scenes on how it all works. I appreciate everyone's help, and without you listeners doing your part to make this show happen, it just wouldn't happen. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy the show. Okay, everybody, I am here with Professor Teodros Kiros of Berkeley School of Music, and I'm just going to give the audience a little bit of a background on why this conversation is happening. I heard Professor Kiros on a conversation recently with Glenn Lowry and Cornel West, and there was a moment in that podcast which I recommend everyone go find. I'll put a link in the show notes. But there was a moment where Professor Kiros, you tried to interject with some concepts about music. And that perked my ears up because I was not thinking I was listening to a music podcast, but as a musician, I heard you mention that you had some ideas for music. And then I was just the whole time wanting you to jump in again and tell me more about this concept of love supreme and some of these musical philosophy ideas that were happening in that conversation. And so welcome to the show. And thank you for agreeing to jump in with me on short notice.
Well, it's a great pleasure. When I saw the invitation, A, I was pleasantly surprised. B, I was flattered. And C, I felt compelled to dig deep into glimpses of what you heard, namely the relationship between philosophy and music. And I wanted to share that with the world. So the invitation is most welcome. And of course, I'm also a television producer myself. I have been one for the past 15 years. So I'm used to giving others a hard time, hardly a hard time, but an opportunity to enter into extended discourses. And here in this particular space, I'll be doing the opposite. And I'll be interviewed, and I hope you're going to be very gentle, very loving. I'm sure you would be. So that we can have meaningful, focused, enlightening discussion guided by what Cornell calls, quite rightly, a singular search for truth.
Yes, absolutely. And your concepts that are kind of on your website, your faculty website there at Berkeley. I found some of your quotes there, and I'm going to include some of those in the show notes too. But one in particular regarding your idea that as musicians, it is inseparable for us to be thinking very deeply and very critically about why we do music, and that is a really important part of the process. So is that something that you actually have a chance to teach there at Berkeley? Could you tell us a little bit about your connection to music and to Berkeley?
I appreciate the question. I spent a few years at several universities, some of which were Boston University itself, a few years there, University of Massachusetts in Boston, a few years there, Suffolk University, a few years, Emerson College, a few years, then finally Brown University, about 3 years, and then a job comes on the scene at Berklee College of Music that was specifically asking for a philosopher, a generalist, who would literally become the philosopher in residence for the college as a whole. When I saw that, I couldn't help but jump on it. Right after I left Brown, and then I did do a few things in between. And what perked my interest, which led me then to be at Berkeley, I think for about 12 years now, a time that I enjoyed profusely because of the love of my students. That opportunity gave me time to think about my days in Ethiopian high schools, in which you may not believe it, I was a musician of some kind. I was a soloist. At the time, I had a good voice. I don't think I have it now. So I did sing in high school, and I was admired here and there. But then, during the time that I was being raised, my father and others did not think much about musicians. Music is something that you would do if you don't have anything else to do. There were no schools for musicians. They were treated very much like goldsmiths and coppersmiths, not much else. Although my interest in music, I remember, was extremely deep. So when this opportunity arrived at Berkeley, I said, my God, this is a God-sent opportunity for me to return to music, and this time as a professional philosopher. So I accepted the job, and my predecessor had developed a minor in philosophy at Berklee College of Music, to which I came, and then I rebuilt that minor. And with the transcendent help, may I proudly say that music has now been, philosophy has now become extremely famous at Berkeley. And the students that become attracted to it, as I always say, are not only technically speaking musicians of musicians, but additionally, they have what I call the sixth sense, a sense for deciphering, dissecting, and understanding the world through the sixth sense that they have, that I and you, of course, in your case, you're a musician, you have it also. But for those of us who don't, but who love music, were intrigued by this sixth sense. Because when I give them any philosophical text, it could be Plato, it could be Aristotle, it could be Kant, it could be Hegel, it could be Zara Jacob. Their interpretive presences in these texts is unique. As a consequence of the use of the sixth sense to guide what they are getting from the texts. That's one. Secondly, I'm also impressed by their discipline. They are so industrious. They are so hardworking. Unlike students, let's say, who make it to Harvard, to Princeton, to Brown, who then, in the course of being on these campuses, begin to discover what they should study and what they should not study, what they are thinking in terms of developing majors, minors, Chris. The typical student who comes to Berkeley is singularly focused on devoting his or her entire life to study one instrument and one instrument only. And they are not thinking in terms of careers, although music is increasingly becoming commodified. Some of them are singularly focused to just master that instrument, master that genre, and nothing else. We're talking about students who rehearse between 10 and 15 hours a day. These are the best of the best. And the typical Berkeley student, I'll defend them, I'll brag about them wherever I go. It's so hardworking that for them, rehearsing their instruments for 1 or 2 hours a day in a very competitive field, Chris, in which you're talking about the presence of, let's say, 100 guitarists. There is only one way of playing the guitar. I always say, don't you worry that the next person who's playing the guitar is going to do something that he cannot do. Professor, they always tell me, do not worry. There is always that voice, that unique voice that is particularly and peculiarly mine. This, of course, is a long-winded answer to an excellent question that you've asked me.
That's wonderful. And it leads me to another, which is that when students arrive there, in your experience, when you're teaching philosophy to a music student and they arrive with that singular focus on their genre, on their instrument, on the artistic side of what they are doing when they arrive at Berkeley, do you find that makes it easier or harder to open their mind to philosophical concepts and include that in their education? Do they resist it at first at all?
No, what is remarkable at Berkeley is that when I first accepted the job and I began offering my philosophy courses, which are essentially Introduction to Western Philosophy, Africana philosophy, philosophy of literature, aesthetics, philosophy of education, about 6 or 7 courses of them. And then I give them these hard texts, let's say Plato's Republic, or his shorter dialogues, the Aeon, the Symposium, Phaedrus. These are very technical texts that philosophers of my age and beyond continue to dissect. Mm-hmm. They are so technical. What impresses me about my Berkeley students is they like the fact that the texts are difficult, so that they can struggle with them the way they struggle with their instruments, Chris. Mm. There is no resistance at all, but curiosity. And there is the polish, the manners. They are so well-mannered, so loving, so respectful. They just make me love teaching tremendously, precisely because of their sense of wonderment, their sense of curiosity, their sense of challenge. They're so used to swim in the dark that when you give them the texts, it's a continuation of the swimming in darkness that they are so used to. In fact, if there is anything that I've noticed that they do not like, it is the simplicity of the arguments in some of these texts, particularly texts that comment on music, because they are the practitioners, they are the performers. In my course, Aesthetics, for example, which is considered to be one of the most popular courses at Berkeley, when I exposed them to Plato, to Kant, to Hegel, and to many, many others, they're continuously responding to these texts, to the narratives in the texts, by comparing them against what they do.
Mm-hmm.
You see the difference? Yes. And I always try to comfort them and say, let me comfort you. Plato, at least, and also much later, when I introduced them to Adorno from the Frankfurt School, I comfort them by saying to them, Adorno was a composer, and Plato himself was a musician. And in that, you're not really reading philosophers who've never touched an instrument, who do not know what music is. Rather, you're reading philosophers who are also very familiar with music. And in that, you're in good hands. And then the discussion takes a radically different turn. They become very trusting. This is particularly true when I engage them with Plato. There is a dialogue, a famous dialogue by Plato called the Aeon, for example, in which Plato is examining the ontology, the nature, the structure of poetry, and most particularly the character of the poet himself or herself. And he is challenging the reader, not necessarily because he believes in the arguments that he's making, namely, for example, that the poet does not know what he's doing, he is merely inspired, but that he deliberately chose the Aeon to explore what humans might be thinking about what poetry is and what the poet does by playing a devil's advocate. My students readily come to understand this, and then they defend themselves against Plato when Plato is trivializing sometimes and misunderstanding the poet as someone who is not a craftsman, who doesn't know what he's doing, but is merely inspired by the muses, and that is done by others, and without thinking about his craft, he is chanting and singing and reading, so forth and so on, whatever he might be doing, which is a discussion of the arts in general. And I specifically challenge them to apply this to music also, so that we can think about the question, does the musician know the craft technically only, or does the musician simply imitate what others have sung, what others have composed, and by blindly imitating them? You can imagine the range, the depth that the discussion takes when I extract these two arguments from Plato, arguments about the nature of poetry and arguments about the role of the muse who is guiding the poet, which could, by suitable modifications, could also be applied to the musician. Say, for example, Strange Fruit by Halliday. Not many people know, for example, that she did not compose it. She did not write it, but when you are listening to her, it's very difficult to decipher the writer, the composer from the performer. So here you have an instance in which you have to carefully think through what Halliday is doing. Is she reciting the lyrics to express herself, or is she simply repeating the lyrics that are written by the writer? Is there a relationship between the singer and the writer, the composer? And in her case, of course, it's very difficult to know, but I hypothesize that she was living, thinking through and embodying herself emotively, emotionally, passionately in the words that have been given to her by this incredible writer. And
she had to make them hers
precisely
before they came out the other side.
Exactly right, because she could have also done it in a different way, like the muse, the relationship between inspiration and the craft, by simply, because she had a wonderful voice, sing it. Mm-hmm. But would it be as compelling, as you just said, if we were to learn, and we evidently do, when we listen very carefully, that she is living the words themselves? It's as if these words were written not necessarily for her, but as if they were. Because when she's singing them, it's very difficult to distinguish the singer from the lyrics, as if the lyrics is written by Halliday. Hence, the general listener does not know that Billie Holiday did not write the lyrics.
Well, and that's wonderful. And I think there's a connection there that's worth pointing out between your students engaging with the philosophical texts that you put in front of them, and then their work that they will do, especially if they are a singer or if they deal with lyrics in any way. There's a connection there in what you mentioned earlier, where they will be engaged with a text and they might find themselves defending themselves against Plato. They might find them defending themselves against Adorno in some way, right? And they're going to pick out different ideas that make sense for them. Now, the same thing can happen with a singer, in my opinion, with lyrics. We can take them in and make them our own. And then when the song is over, we can try on another, almost like trying on a different jacket. We can take the lyrics of a different composer, a different lyricist later, and try on those ideas and make them our own. It's kind of one of I see as one of the unique things in music for singers, people who deal with the lyrics of others, and that we use our philosophical training, if we've had any, in some way, to understand what it feels like to take on the ideas of other people, try them out, and then discard them in some cases, and then we get to keep the ideas that make our lives better. And I think in a lot of ways, that's what a philosophy class teaches you to do, is to dig into texts and figure out which concepts of those great thinkers apply to your life. And some of them might not, and some of them might. And I'm sitting here kind of jealous that this was not part of my music training. I didn't have any philosophical courses in my music training. And I think what you're doing there at Berkeley, it seems kind of rare, as in I've never heard of it happening anywhere else.
At the expense of bragging a bit, and I have no reason to brag. If anybody should brag as a consequence of attempting to respond to this question that you're asking, it's my students themselves, in the following sense. I have to develop this carefully. What they do typically is I give them a text. As I said, say, Ian, the dialogue, the relationship between inspiration and craft. And then they read it. And then they compare it against what they're doing. And then they realize that there is a tension, interpretive tension between what they think music is and what Plato thinks music is, Chris.
Mm-hmm.
And what I love about what my students do is that even when they feel attacked by Plato, because I said in the ER, he's playing a devil's advocate because he himself was a musician of musicians. He was a poet of poets. He knows that the poet, exactly like the musician, is a machine, a poetic machine in the case of the poet, and a musical machine in the case of the musicians. I joke with them and I call them the Berkeley music machine, by which I mean the technical bravado, their creativity. When they talk about chords, scales, rhythm, harmony, they fascinate me. I could listen to them for hours. So they know that Plato couldn't possibly begin to think that the poet does not know what he's doing. In the case of the rhapsode, who is simply reciting Homer. Of course he does. And of course my students also know that. But they are so humble that instead of resisting the critique, they give it the benefit of the doubt so that they can question themselves and develop a relationship with philosophy. Mm-hmm. In most cases, for the first time.
One interesting thing about the Choralosophy podcast is that it is completely independently produced, meaning there is no organization, no institution, no foundation behind this show or behind this production. There's no company, nothing. It's all supported by listeners and listener involvement. The most direct way that you can do that is through Patreon. At patreon.com/Choralosophy, you can join a subscribers only environment where I put extra content, meaning a behind the scenes episode every month, supplemental materials. The people on the Patreon get to see who's coming on the show ahead of time, which means they can put bugs in my ear ahead of time about what I should ask the person about. All kinds of fun perks. There's even an awesome Choralosophy hat and t-shirt. There's all kinds of fun ways to do that over at Patreon. Now, it's an important thing because if you enjoy this show, a couple thousand or so people that tune in on a regular basis to this show, if 10% of you were to join the Patreon, it would change the game for my ability to make this production better and better over the course of the next year. So I producers. There is a producer level that you can opt into over there as well. The Patreon producers are Ulrika Igrain Munoz Alarcon, Chandler Smith, David Kowalczyk, Kyle Peterson, Michael Herron, Ryan Main, and Steve and Kathy Kakachik. Yeah, that's wonderful. And I feel like that's actually something I could speak now outside of the music world and think in the bigger picture that I'm sure you probably would agree with this, that more people need to be engaged philosophically in their education. And like I said, I've read quite a bit of philosophy, but I had to go seek it out myself. So as I said earlier, I'm a bit jealous I didn't have your guidance along the way, because it would have been so much fun. But one of the things that I find lacking is that we seem to struggle as a society right now to engage with the devil's advocate in a sense, that like it needs to be ideas presented to me that I already agree with, and then I will engage with those ideas. And I find that extremely harmful. And what I'm interested in to hear you explain how your students approach these concepts, some of which, as you said, there's tension with what they already think, right? And but they engage it with humility and trying to figure out what, as I said before, which parts of that they can pull out. And so I think that's wonderful. And I wonder if you see that too in the broader society, where you might want to just sit everybody down in your classroom and teach them how to think about other ideas.
Yes, that's my dream, Chris. But this might sound very authoritarian. But I sometimes dream exactly about what he said, and how well he said it. How wonderful the world could be, I think, if one were listening to music on the radio. We're also philosophically equipped to think about the role that music could play in our life. Mm. I always tell my students, and I mean it from the depth of my heart, that philosophy, as brilliant as some of its practitioners turned out to be, namely the founders of it, the great Egyptian priests, to which Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, and a host of other humble Greeks went to and learned it from these Egyptian priests, and then brought it to Athens, brought it to Greece, proudly. Athens founds the first school of philosophy after he spent, I think, about 45 years in ancient Egypt. Pythagoras, the mathematician, we're told, spent about 25 years in ancient Egypt. And then, intrigued by what he learned, he couldn't help but bring this horizon, this perspective, this vision, this sense of wonderment, this imagination, and share it with the citizens of the place to which he became born. And he too introduces a philosophically dissected understanding of mathematics to Athens. Mm-hmm. And then both Pythagoras and Thales make philosophy their own. And from that point onwards, they develop a unique relationship with philosophy, which becomes the basis of what we now call European philosophy.
Right.
So, you see, and what I want to see then is for human beings, when they are listening to music, to be inspired by it. And I tell my students, yes, the Egyptians found philosophy. The Greeks honed it, cultivated it, made it their own, and gave us the foundation for Western philosophy. But then I always say, in spite of all these achievements, there is nothing, in my judgment, I mean it, as exciting and as popularizable and as attractive as music is. Very few individuals are willing to invest their time in philosophy, except professional philosophers and some curious human beings, such as you, from what I'm sensing. But I cannot think of a single human being who is not attracted to philosophy. to music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You see?
You're right. It is extremely popularizable. I like that the word you chose there. One criticism that I see right now in the of the world, I guess, is that we are almost there are some influences, I should say, that would have us look at the story you just told about, say, Pythagoras or other ideas that come from Egypt and then go to Athens to become their own, that some might call that now stealing the ideas. We're being told that those ideas have been stolen or they've been appropriated and they've been used by, right? And my concern is that with music, if we start to apply that logic, that we're going to have a slowing down of the spread of those ideas, not an amplification of them. And the idea that you could separate, for example, a musical genre and draw boundaries around it and say this is where this came from. When you zoom in on those ideas, it gets really blurry really fast of where the influences for this genre came from, or because it's just humans trading ideas gradually over thousands of years all across the planet, just like philosophy is. The ancient Egyptians have a concept that gets taken across to Greece, and then it becomes something new, and then somebody visits ancient Greece and they learn a thing and it becomes something new in their mind. It's the idea that ideas themselves sexually reproduce. My ideas intertwine with your ideas and they become a new idea. And I think that's beautiful. And I feel like we should be cheerleading that with every opportunity that we have. Is that something you ever come across or think about?
Incredible. And I'm not going to praise you emptily, but I must praise you. That was a brilliant understanding of what I had in mind, even worked it deeper for me. I don't like the term stealing.
Right. Exactly.
This is not about stealing. This is about sharing.
Yep.
Ideas and creativities created by human beings who did not necessarily choose to be born as Egyptians, as Greeks, as Belgians, and so forth and so on. This is rather shallow. It is rather provincial. It's so unintelligent. What it is about is, here were the Egyptians about 2,500 years ago, who gave us the first portrait of the philosopher, a human being in a seated position, who looked very much like our image of the Buddha, who is staring at the stars, wondering, imagining, thinking about his existence or her existence. I prefer to use the binary terms. Let's say his or its existence, but I can't say it's because we're talking about a human being. But on the other hand, why not? Because the first thing that emerged out of the human womb ultimately was an it, before we gave it linguistic designations of maleness, femaleness, colorness, so forth and so on, but is neither there nor here. So we have a portrait of this thinker in despair, wondering, imagining, looking at the stars, and also struggling with ancient texts, reading them, interpreting them, developing relationships with them, and also thinking about what he did that day, how well he did it at the end of the day, which reminds me of Marcus Aurelius, much later, the Roman emperor thinker, who apparently, by practicing Stoicism, was also doing something of that sort, critiquing him, and also consciously developing the practice of moderation. That is the excesses and deficiencies, by not excessively wanting something and then deficiently depriving yourself of it, but developing a median, a golden median between excess and deficiency. This portrait of the thinker in despair comes out of an ancient Egyptian text, which Pythagoras, Thales, and others who went there were fascinated by, because of which they became attracted to philosophy. Here it is. What is the origin of this insight? Human curiosity. If you ask the ancient Egyptian, I'll bet you my life on it. If he thought he was black or white, he would laugh at you. This was not an obsession. As I said, the first self was an it. Before language intervenes and designates it statically and gives it a stable ontological structure, which is a mistake. If this is the case, then Pythagoras, Thales, and others, as humans, humbly become attracted to this practice. They bring it to Athens. From that point onwards, you hit it on the nail. It becomes Greek. It becomes their own. And let's say a Swiss picks it up later. A Chinese picks up later. It is going to progressively, perpetually cultivate itself, self-originate itself, and it becomes, it takes the color and form of the place in which it is growing. There is no stealing of legacies here. What we have here is a sharing of the products of human thinking.
Absolutely. And that is extremely well put. And I think one of the things that, when you were describing the Egyptian thinker in despair, that picture that you were painting there, I was sitting here thinking, he is describing me.
Yes.
I think about those things. I sit and stare at the stars and think about those things. When I'm at the end of an evening and I've got my bourbon in my glass and my day is over and I'm sitting and looking at my children, looking at the stars, whatever it is that I'm doing, and I'm reflecting on my day, wondering how it could have gone better. What could I do to make my life better tomorrow? These are human things to think about. They are not uniquely mine. And even though you might have described a picture of an ancient Egyptian, while I am not Egyptian, I don't fit into one of those linguistic categories that person might have fit into. You are still describing me, and I think that's extremely valuable aspect of music as well. I mean, how many times as teenagers did we all turn on the radio and hear the lyrics of a song and internalize them as oh, this must have been written about me, right? That's the beauty of how philosophy intertwines with music, as I see it, in that it is a way for us to express and to share our common humanity in the same way that I've made this reference on the show a couple times, where we can start to see that Kanye West might have something to say that Palestrina also would have wanted to say. And that there is something uniquely and universally human about music expression that we actually, I believe, set ourselves back when we try to figure out which linguistic box it needs to go in first.
Indeed, Chris. And I can tell you how fulfilled I feel. Because in the course of having this interview with you, I am having for the first time from all the interviews that I have given, that this God-sent opportunity to speak to a musician like you is giving me an opportunity to critically evaluate what I think is right in this relationship between philosophy and music. And I feel inspired and encouraged to continue sharing this modest insight for my students. Now that I hear that a musician like yourself thinks that I'm not a fool after all, that I may have unraveled something that through proper, careful working out might give us a vision of this relationship between philosophy and music, so that, as I always tell my students, through a unison of these two powerful, potent horizons of the self, horizons of the human, we can, after all, take the project of of changing this miserable world seriously, that it could actually be done. And then that the musician could play a central role in the project of getting us out of this morass of confusion, unnecessary racism, sexisms, genderisms, so that we can return to what I told my colleagues in the department meeting yesterday, so that we can return to be guided as we're attempting to change ourselves, not by the racial gaze, not by the sexual gaze, not by the gendered gaze, although these are appropriate responses to human suffering, but by what I call the human gaze, the search for the human.
Mm-hmm.
My next book, if I live long enough to write it,
okay,
will have that title, The Search for the Human Gaze.
That's wonderful.
When I return to Egypt, I'm not necessarily returning to Egypt to empower dark-skinned human beings who want to look for a center in ancient Egypt, because Egypt belongs to humanity.
Absolutely.
All of us. You put it beautifully. That portrait could be a portrait of you when you're a thinker in despair at night, trying to figure out how the day went by, whom you offended, whom you didn't, whom you did not attend to, whom you were not kind to, whom you were unnecessarily kind to, whom you did not try to transform, so forth and so on. It becomes a practice on the part of the self to think through what it means to exist, what it means to be a human being, which is to continuously interrogate yourself.
Yeah,
philosophy to me is nothing more than technically obtuse, unnecessarily obtuse, because some of these philosophers were brilliant thinkers, were horrible writers. They made the field so difficult, so impenetrable, so that it could create jobs for professional philosophers, that ordinary human beings become discouraged from even exploring it, afraid that they're reading something that is written by a god, forgetful of the fact that it's written by a human being, just like you and me.
You are such a kindred spirit to me right now. I'm freaking out how great this is, because one of the things you mentioned earlier is in as you started that that little segment, is that you talked about staring at the horizons, and that ability that we all have as humans to look to the horizon. And so I thought of a metaphor as you were describing that, where philosophers and musicians, when properly trained, when I say properly trained, I mean properly trained philosophically, that we understand what it is that we are trying to do and why. We should be always looking at a horizon. And the metaphor of the horizon for me is powerful, because you can walk forever and never get there.
That's right.
You will never get there. And so a musician has to be always looking at the horizons, because they understand that there is always one connection that they can make next time they play or sing. There's always one technical thing that they can fix for the next time. There is no such thing as perfection. There is no such thing as perfectly harmonically aligned. That will not exist in nature, because nature is chaos. And yet we try anyway. Okay. Now, with a philosopher, in my opinion, has to do the same thing. And I love how you touched on the end of I'll call it the toxic philosopher, that is a bad writer, making people think that they can't access the information, they can't access the concept. Because one of the things I say frequently is that I love philosophy, but oftentimes hate philosophers, because and I don't use hate in like the real term. It just drives me insane, because of what you just described, which is that sometimes philosophy can be used as a cudgel to make someone feel like they're the one who doesn't have the right answer. But if philosophy is being practiced in what it sounds like you and I both agree is a horizon model of philosophy, which is that that there is no arriving at the final end point of philosophy. There is always discovering the next thing, which leads you to the next thing. And as long as we have that intellectual humility, that intellectual flexibility, to acknowledge that that my philosophy might be very thorough, and I might have read a lot of stuff. But that does not mean that I have cornered the market on truth. As long as we stay there with our music and our philosophy, then we continue to be open to each other and to open to new experiences.
I couldn't, I'm so humbled by you, particularly by what you did with the metaphor of the horizon. And Chris, let me also add to that something that I would like you to help me out to work out further. This notion of infinite consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
You see, there is a relationship between the horizon, as you were describing it, and infinite consciousness, which is the ultimate grounding of human existence.
Mm-hmm. And infinite harmony in music.
Infinite harmony in music.
It never ends.
It never ends. There is no beginning, there is no end.
Mm-hmm.
Provided that, as you put it, you are continuously curious.
Right. Yep.
What I love about my students is that they're observers of the human condition. They're continuously observing.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Professor, I want to change gears slightly because I want to make sure I don't run out of time. I do want to hear more about Love Supreme. That's that aspect that you were mentioning on that show with Glenn Lowry and Cornell West. And I'm going to be in class here because I had never heard that term before. And I would like for you to tell me, because I'm assuming my audience won't know much of this either. What is Love Supreme and why is it important?
Love Supreme, as you know, is a 32 minutes rendition of a classic jazz composition in the instrumentation tradition, because there are no lyrics, done by Coltrane.
Okay.
He died at the age of 45. Coltrane is famously known for his obsession, might not be the right term, but linguistically undefinable relationship with what he is trying to look for through and in music.
Mm-hmm.
The metaphor of the horizon, which I try to supplement with the notion of infinite consciousness, is precisely what Coltrane uncovered later, before he died, after he freed himself from addiction to drugs, which obstructed his path, the paths of his musicality, according to his own judgment, so that he could mature with the discovery of his potentialities that he attributes to the transcendental gift that he was given to be cured of addiction, so that he could commit himself in the horn with which his mother used to locate him in the morning after he's been practicing the whole night. And then he would fall asleep and mom would come to his room to look for Coltrane, and she will notice that the horn is still in his mouth, that he has been practicing, and then he fell asleep in the process, and so on. He was looking for something. I'll use the idea of a 17th century Ethiopian philosopher on whom I wrote a book called Yacob, and Colin, the philosopher of the rationality of the human heart, who in my native tongue, one of my native tongues, classical gears, led him to develop two methods, as he called them, of developing a relationship with the transcendent, in his case, with God, and in my case, as a philosopher, with the search for what I've called infinite consciousness, and which he earlier called horizons, he develops two devices, two methods through which you can relentlessly, unflinchingly practice this. He called them hatata, which means inquiring, meditating, like that ancient Egyptian thinker in despair. Hatata, hatata. And the second one, hasasa, which means looking for. Because this infinite consciousness, in this case, this God, is not easy to locate. He is everywhere. Let me use the binary term. He or she is everywhere and nowhere. And the task of the thinker in despair is to engage in hasasa, to look for, to search. Coltrane, in Love Supreme, is engaged in hasasa. He's looking for this absent God whom he thinks freed him from addictions. And now he has been put on the philosophical pedestal of deserving the possibility of developing a relationship with God, because God might want to reveal itself to him if he engages both in hatata, inquiry, meditation, a prayerful attitude with God, and also hasasa, looking for, searching. Love Supreme is a methodically developed attempt at engaging in hasasa, looking for God, looking for infinite consciousness. And it has four movements, as you know. There is an acknowledgement, and then the awakening begins as a consequence of hasasa, of looking for a long time. And then the transcendent must have felt for Coltrane. Wow. He or she revealed, disclosed itself to Coltrane. And then he moves to the second movement. He is now committed to courageously, critically, thoughtfully follow the new path that has been created for him through the exercise of resolution. The resolution is the commitment to courageously look for infinite consciousness, which further leads him to what is technically called pursuance. And no practice of what I've called Zarayaku, the hasasa and the hatata now becomes a way of life for Coltrane. Mm-hmm. And then the final movements, the bliss. This he draws from the Vedanta tradition, from Eastern philosophy, the bliss, the light. He has seen it now.
That's amazing. And it sounds like, as you described that, well, so passionately you described that music and his process, that it, I'm going to guess, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it sounds like you are, as you describe that, you are imagining that the music itself and Coltrane's process of going through that to create it is dripping with metaphor for us as musicians across genres, but also for us as a world. That this is almost like he's encapsulated a process in creating that piece of music that, like we were talking about before, our dreams for a better world. What if that process was all of our process?
Chris, it's incredible, Chris. I don't know what you do. Again, I'm going to praise you. This was unbelievable. That's exactly right. Chris, I can't tell you how much you're helping me to work through what I'm trying to say. And I'm not exactly satisfied with that I'm trying to say, but I'm really trying. And you said it all.
You should never be satisfied, though. Never be satisfied, because we're always going for that horizon.
Absolutely right, Chris. I am not satisfied at all. I'm still exploring this, and I may die without really getting it right. I don't want to be laughed at by the generations to come for what I'm trying to say, which is being said inadequately, incompletely, unprecisely. Perhaps I'm being ridiculed in living rooms by philosophers who are listening to this, but I'm making a sincere attempt, following Zarayaku, my mentor, the founder of enlightenment in the African tradition, and I'm trying to engage in Hasasa and Hatata. And I'm demanding from the world that when we listen to music,
Absolutely, absolutely, and I know here how I would say that is I know that I will die having not yet figured it out, and that doesn't scare me. The only thing that would scare me is to know that I died having given up on figuring it out. Because maybe this ties into your infinite consciousness concept here, which is that I know that it's not my job by myself to figure it all out. That is not the burden placed on me in my single lifetime to be the one who solves the world's problems by the time I die. But what I would like to do is I would like to leave a legacy behind to my children and to my students, and to whoever I can influence, we do have the burden of curiosity. We have the burden of looking and searching, so that the march of human progress and flourishing continues after I'm gone. That's what I set forth for myself as a personal, I guess, goal. Is where I would want to look back on my deathbed if I get the opportunity, if I'm lucky enough to be able to be thinking back on my life when I'm going. It is that did I sufficiently search? Not did I sufficiently find, but did I sufficiently search? And that's kind of I think maybe that's what attracts me to both music and philosophy.
Again, Chris, sometimes when certain things are said so well, I prefer to humbly soak them in, as opposed to unnecessarily attempting to add anything to them. I think said what I would have liked to say. That too is my dream. And what I'm learning now, because I'm heavily reading about the brain, in contrast to the mind, because these two, which we unnecessarily conflate, are not the same. The brain is a physical organ, and of course, we still do not know how the brain works. But we do know considerably more, thanks to scientific curiosities, how the brain works than we do how the mind works, how infinite consciousness works. Through the brain, it may never be possible to understand the nature of infinite consciousness itself. And for me, the new knowledge, the new discovery that infinite consciousness is ultimately unknowable, whereas the brain could be known as well as it is possible, which then, when we know the structure, the function of the brain, unlike certain, not all, neurologists who think that once we completely understand the nature of the brain, then we can correspondingly then also know the nature of infinite consciousness. This is a mistake. In fact, when we do know the brain completely, we will know it such that the brain is not capable of ever knowing what infinite consciousness is. And in that, to tie it with what you said earlier, then the beauty of practicing Hasasa and Hatata should not be to find the nature of infinite consciousness, but to search for it and then die as you are doing so. And your job would have been done. You will have died with the practice of humility, the humility of not knowing that which has equipped you one day to be capable of knowing, which might not include knowing the nature of infinite consciousness itself, but might include the nature of not ever being able, sufficiently empowered to know what infinite consciousness is, but to at least know that the brain, the physical dimension of it, the physical part of infinite consciousness could at least enlighten you, awaken you, as it did Coltrane, that your task is to engage in perpetual hasasa, perpetual looking for, as you put it, without ever finding anything. But you die in the course of knowing that you should not stop looking for the horizons.
Right. So that is also wonderful, and we're running short on time, and so I want to kind of wrap up with this idea. This has just been so great. I could talk to you all day, I think. But one of my biggest concerns with the world today is almost, again, so beautifully articulated amongst what you just said, which is that how do I want to put this delicately without attacking anyone? I feel like a lot of our arguments that we engage in as society right now could be boiled down to really one philosophical problem, which is that we have a lack, it seems, of intellectual humility in how much of the world we are even capable of understanding in the first place. Meaning, how can I state my political opinion, for example, or state my my idea of how we should talk about race or gender or whatever else it is that's a hot button topic for people to talk about and argue about. If I recognize, and how do I state that with so much certainty that I have cornered the market on truth? If I realize how tiny of a fraction of what is real in the universe I can even wrap my mind around because of the limitation of my brain, because of the limitation of my mind, even that I haven't. And so to me, that's where the breakdown happens, is we could disagree on all those things. But if all parties were to decide to engage in those conversations with intellectual humility, with the acknowledgement that as part of infinite consciousness, I know that I can't access all the information. So this other person that I'm talking to right now might have a little piece of that information that I don't have. And if I have any dream of getting closer to that answer, then I've got to engage with that person, because they clearly disagree with me because of something they've experienced that I have not experienced.
Incredible. That's exactly right. I think if time permits, in fact, I would be more than happy in the future to come and begin to have a conversation precisely on what you've just started, namely this partially examined relationships that we have with sex, gender, and sex, which one we compare with what we could know about the self, about what we could know about the human being, which by definition itself is incomplete, because infinite consciousness is not knowable, should lead us not to take these appearances such as sex, race, and gender too seriously, because they are appearances, the status of which, the nature of which we do not know. We simply think that being a Republican, a Democrat, a this or that are descriptions of these appearances. They really are not. Again, like you, I don't want to attack anybody. I simply want to make the final point. It is good to know that these appearances are illusions.
Mm-hmm.
And illusions are dangerous. They should be known for what they are. They are illusions. Unexamined truths, or truths that are only partly examined. And in that, when we meet a human being who thinks differently from us, this should not be a justification to make unintelligent decisions not to talk to that person, but as you put it, this becomes in fact an intelligent opportunity, no matter how deep and how dangerous the zone of engaging that person who disagrees with you is. You have to take that courageous risk of engaging that person, talking to that person, knowing that person, and developing a relationship with that person. This is exactly what we're not doing. And this is exactly the ultimate source of the miserable world that we have created.
Well, I completely agree. And I also agree that we should, at some point in the future, do this again and kind of start at that point, because that would be a really interesting, completely separate conversation about some of the things. I'm now fascinated to hear more. And I think my audience will probably have had as much fun over the last hour as I did. So we'll definitely want to get you back on the show at some point and just keep trying to solve the world's problems as we search for the horizon. How does that sound?
That is incredible. And of course, if I ever come back, what I would like us to discuss, and I was ready to begin the discussion today, is my challenge of my students in class, about which you read a little bit in what was written about what I do at Berkeley. I challenge them to make lyrics for those who do non-instrumental music philosophical, by which I mean it has to be guided by a mission, by a purpose, and by a commitment to transform human consciousness.
That sounds like a great episode too.
Yes, I think that.
Yeah. And the great thing about this show is I'm the boss of the show, so I get to decide if how many episodes we do. And let's just keep in touch, and we'll continue to develop some ideas because I think this is going to be very helpful to people.
I thank you dearly from the depth of my heart. This is one of the best interviews that I have given in my career.
Oh wow, and
I'm grateful.
You're going to inflate my ego, and you're going to make it harder for me to continue to search for truth, because I'll think that I already found it. You got to be careful.
I enjoyed we had fun.
Okay, that's great. I will be, like I said, I will be in touch, and we'll have to do this again.
Thank you so much.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you as always for sticking around to the end of a conversation. Wow. There will be more of Professor Kiros on this show. I will see to that. What an amazing intellect, and what an amazing connection that he has been able to make through his position there at Berkeley, taking his life's work, philosophy, and interweaving it with our life's work. I had no idea such a post at an academic institution existed, and I am just incredibly excited to have more conversations with Professor Kiros and dive into the depths of choralosophy and philosophy and music and all of the different things that are really the ethos and the pathos of this show. That is what we are all about on this show, is trying to get to the depth of what might be true, as you heard us just discuss. So if you enjoyed that conversation, please share it. Tell all of your colleagues, tell all of your friends that this is a good way to have a conversation about our profession. And of course, share, support the show in any way that you can on the way out, whether it be joining the Patreon, patreon.com/choralosophy, using that choralosophy promo code at any of the 5 sponsors on the show. It's just incredibly helpful anytime you interact with the content, and that helps me spread the word. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next time.